This is Keys to the Shop, episode 112, The Power of Stories, with the host of the Filter Stories podcast, James Harper. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host, and today we are privileged to dive into the topic of stories with someone who has dedicated himself full-time to telling the untold stories of the coffee industry. This is really going to be great, so stay tuned. And today's episode is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Now, Prima is the specialty coffee equipment supplier. They're based out of Louisville, Kentucky, and from the beginning of their company, they've set out to make the best coffee brewing equipment available to the general public and professionals alike. Their focus is on curating the best equipment for every need you might have. That goes from grinders to espresso machines, under-counter refrigeration, pretty much anything you can think of, both for home and commercials. So if you're in need of commercial equipment for a shop that you're going to open up someday, or you want to upgrade the equipment in your current shop, you definitely want to reach out to Prima Coffee. They put a big emphasis on having the expertise to help their customers get the right gear to fit every situation. Now, all you need to do is go to prima-coffee.com. That's prima-coffee.com. Reach out to them, email, phone, let them know that Keys to the Shop sent you. And thank you so much to Prima for their support of Keys to the Shop. Now, this episode is also brought to you by Pacific Foods. They're the folks behind the Pacific Barista Series line of non-dairy performance beverages, and those are designed specifically for professional baristas and the standards for excellence that they demand. Whether we're talking about almond, soy, coconut, rice, or oat milk, its ability to take the heat from steaming and produce an unmatched silky texture and keep the flavor balance focused on coffee makes it a perfect choice for your cafe's menu. So Pacific is a huge supporter of the specialty coffee industry, and they demonstrate their passion for the community by listening to and serving the needs of real specialty coffee professionals. So I would encourage you, go visit pacificfoods.com. That's pacificfoods.com, and learn more about the Barista Series line of non-dairy performance beverages and see how that can elevate the non-dairy offerings you give your customers in the cafe. So my thanks to Pacific for their support of Keys to the Shop. So today we're talking with the host of the new coffee podcast, Filter Stories, James Harper. On every level of the supply chain in coffee, there are people who have amazing stories, and, most of them are never told. So much of our perception of a person is shaped around a narrative that works for business, but it keeps it on surface level, leaving out the rich and real and sometimes hard to hear details that come from truly understanding and knowing where somebody is coming from. That's where James Harper comes in. He has committed himself to seeking out, as his tagline says, the stories hidden in your cup of coffee, and telling those stories on his podcast in a way that really respects the depth that is in them, and does it in such a way that lets us truly connect with that individual, their experiences at a deep level. And it really is doing great work to bring the industry into a greater understanding and bringing the industry together. So James has worked in coffee for a while now. He worked wholesale coffee for grinders in Melbourne. He has also helped stage manage the World Barista Championships for a couple of years and was the international wholesale manager for The Barn Berlin. He started Filter Stories because he came across so many incredible personal stories that inspired him and changed him while he was carving out his career in coffee. They were complex, they were profound, and sometimes uncomfortable, but they really changed him. And that impact made him want to turn around and share these stories with the world. And we have Filter Stories. And so we're going to get behind the scenes and learn James's story, a little bit of how he came to be in the position he is, and how we can understand and embrace story as an integral part of what we do as professionals in the cafe. There's a lot of real great insight in this episode, so I do hope you enjoy it. I know I really enjoyed talking with James. So here now is my conversation with the host of Filter Stories podcast, James Harper. James Harper, Filter Stories. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to Keys to the Shop.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me on the show. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, great to talk to you as well. I've been loving the episodes coming out of Filter Stories, and we, broadcast a little bit of Martin's story. That was your inaugural episode on the show, with Matt Perger's show, a couple weeks back. And I'm excited to kind of dive in and get the behind the scenes of you and Filter Stories and all that you're accomplishing through this podcast. So I'm really excited.
Well, thank you for sharing that at the end of your podcast with Matt. And I think, super excited to share really what has been a very steep learning curve in what stories mean for both baristas as professionals and professionals across the board. Story is really at the heart of everything we do. And once you understand that, it's amazing the power of stories to really make change in your cafe or in your life. That's what I found.
Yeah, agreed. To start off, I think any good story, I suppose, in the beginning, once upon a time, James Harper came on the scene in coffee. So I wonder if you could just talk to us about your own story in coffee. Like, where did it begin for you, and how have you come to this place of giving other people a platform for their stories?
For sure. So we need to rewind all the way back to 2012. I'm in a desk. It's a bit like Murray's story, really, which is the second episode of Filter Stories, which I recommend you also listen to. But I'm behind a desk in London, spinning the wheels of corporate world and not being very passionate or excited about what I'm doing. And what I am finding, though, is that there's a local cafe which I keep going to, and there's this amazing world of flavors and people who are really passionate about coffee, and they're very warm and welcoming. And I keep going back to this place and get to the point where I get to know the baristas so well that, I invite them to my house parties and vice versa. And when I finally decide to leave the world of finance, I had to think of, I went traveling the world, 6 months on a motorcycle in India, volunteering in the jungles of Borneo for 3 months, blah, 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 quarter life crisis, millennial stuff. And then I thought, well, what do I do now with my life? And I kept thinking back to those really incredible times I had at that cafe with the passionate baristas in the coffee community. And I was like, well, let's do this. This looks good. It feels good. Let's do it. So fast forward a year and a half, and I land in Melbourne. And in Melbourne, it's kind of a strange sight. Here I am. It's 2015. I don't have any really coffee skills at all to speak of, other than the fact that I'm just very passionate about it. And I'm trying to find a job in coffee somewhere, doing something, anything. And for 4 months, all I get are rejections. It's very, very hard to get a job as a barista or a coffee professional in Australia, in Melbourne, of all places, if you're not really qualified to begin with. But, I pursued it, and then eventually got a job actually in sales for a very large Italian roastery, which was dabbling a little bit in specialty. And that was the beginning of the coffee career. And stage managing the Australian Barista Championships, which was also a lot of fun and was very rewarding as an experience professionally and personally. And then basically fast forward a little bit further, and a love interest takes me over to Europe, and that doesn't go anywhere. But hey, I'm in Berlin now, and I'm managing the wholesale department for a Berlin coffee roaster. I learn a lot. It's a very valuable experience. And then there comes a point where it's like, okay, now what? I can't really go much further here. It's time to do something of my own. And, you look across the world, the coffee space, and you're like, well, what is there that's missing in this space? I love stories. And the one thing I've always really wanted is a professionally produced story podcast, which tells me the stories that people that aren't really talking about, but are the really important stories to listen to. I want this American life with coffee is what I want to find, really. I think, well, I can't find it. And I say, okay, well, let's see if I can make it. And let's just see where that takes me. I quickly realized that when I dive into the stories and I find, the people I talk to do stories about it for Filter Stories, these are incredibly powerful stories. As I do them, they completely shift how I see the coffee world. I went to Asheville, which was my first episode, went to Asheville, not really, as a cis male, heterosexual dude, thought I thought I was reasonably progressive, and that experience completely transformed how I approach masculinity. And I thought that was so powerful. And then similarly, I went to Ecuador to pursue a story about a farmer there, which is episode 2. And I finally saw specialty coffee for what it really is. And I'm not sure, I don't know. There's a lot that wasn't working for me. And I wanted to show that through the story of someone who gave 8 years of his life to eventually, well, I won't ruin the story, but it's not a happy story. But I wanted to share that. And then I realized these are stories, and people were really like, how do I put it? When people first heard these stories, strangers on the internet would reach out saying that these stories had touched them on an emotional level, that it had made them reevaluate how they saw specialty coffee, how they saw a certain aspect of whatever the story was about. And that kind of change, it's powerful. And I'm like, wow, I need to do more of this. This is, people want it. It's very valuable in their lives. I need to start creating more of this. And there are people out there who have amazing stories, but they're not being shared because there's really no marketing incentive to share them, because they're not the easiest stories to share. And so, long story short, here's Filter Stories.
Well, and so your history of kind of globetrotting for a little bit, did that have something to do with your development of love for stories? Personally speaking, what is so powerful about stories for you, or in general, what is it that really is behind the transformational power of stories?
What is story? Stories are a way for us to process a very complicated, illogical, random world. That's the world we live in. If you look at this, the raw number around us, the raw data as to why things happen, life is just full of random coincidences that really have no meaning. Story is our attempt to understand what's really happening in the world, to cut through the noise and to figure out what's important. And we do that by looking at our own story, telling the stories about ourselves. And we do that by looking around us and telling stories about other people or other things. And not only that, we are constantly updating this story as well about ourselves and about the world around us. And you need to really recognize that this is what we're doing to then realize the power of this story. If you're in a negative mindset and you feel like you're in a kind of victim, you're always a victim in a lot of situations, that's just a story you tell yourself. You can also reframe that in the positive, and so that you have control over your story. And this is really beautifully put together. I'm going to plug a different show, Invisibilia, in one of their episodes, which I talk about in the newsletter. So sign up to the newsletter if you'd like to get a link to this, where they talk about a woman who loses her husband, and she's Jewish and he's Israeli. Sorry, I guess they're both Israeli. And as soon as her husband, she loses her husband through old age, the story she's told herself about why she is alive all of a sudden doesn't make sense anymore. And she has to literally skydive as a 70-year-old woman to be able to recreate a story which it permits her husband to be a part of her story, but as a husband that's not around anymore. And that's a very dramatic example, but we do it all the time in light of new information. We are always evaluating the stories about ourselves so that we can understand who we are, what the world is, and what the future looks like, and what we should do.
Well, so looking out to the coffee industry as you did, you said earlier that there was a lack of stories, or at least a lack of a platform, and that's why you started this podcast. Mm-hmm. But what is it? There are stories being told, and they're being told in different ways, in shops and blog posts and things like that. So, what is that gap? What is the gap? Like, let's put it this way: what frustrates you the most about how we do tell stories in the coffee industry?
For one, a lot of the stories that we hear in the industry are marketing driven. There's a place for that, that's fine, but I think there needs to be more of a balance between genuine stories that cover difficult topics that need to be discussed and, self-promotional marketing. And I feel there's a space for us to talk about the really difficult issues which are within coffee. And I think stories are a great way to talk about that because they can really engage us in a way that you wouldn't be engaged if you just were to have a dry academic debate. Let's take, for example, the issue of misogyny in coffee, or the fact it's a very male-dominated industry. Not that the two are interlinked, but this is a topic that we should care more about. People are talking about it, but how do we? It's a difficult topic to discuss. It's kind of touchy. It's not really clear, how we go about doing this. You won't find this topic discussed in marketing. It's an important discussion that should happen, and we should come out the other end of it with a much better idea of a much better outcome to make it less male-dominated and less misogynistic, if that is the case. How do we build that interest? Well, you build the interest through story. Because if we were to talk about misogyny in coffee, it's like, well, that sounds very academic and very dry. But if you hear the story from the perspective of someone whose life is affected by misogyny, then all of a sudden we can both care about that person, and if we care about that person, we want to have a debate which finds answers so that person doesn't have to feel the way they're feeling. That's the job of filter stories, to unpack the issues within coffee that we'd rather not talk about, but they're important to talk about because they make the industry a more socially and environmentally progressive industry.
What is it that makes us stay at the surface and be satisfied with just the marketing stories that we explore? We don't really go deeper.
First things first, you need a reason to share a story. We're all primarily quite self-interested, creatures. That's human nature, I guess. So marketing has a very clear motive. We want to sell a product. Why would you share a story unless it really kind of impacted a value that you hold very, very close to your chest? That happens. So, for example, in the Asheville story, which is my first episode, a story is shared about a community which is affected adversely by misogyny. And that's an important story to share because the community says, we do not want misogyny in our community. And they build their identities around that. Outside of that context, outside of that kind of emergency, this is a crisis, the values of the community are at stake. Okay, there's a farmer in Ecuador. How do you even know what their story is in the first place? Very few of us actually know. There are huge information asymmetries in coffee. The barista's relying on the roaster, and the roaster's relying on the import, and the importer's probably relying on the guy on the ground that they hire to get the coffee. And to what extent does that person even know what the farmer's true story is? And so these stories aren't getting to coffee drinkers just because there are just too many links in the chain.
Why is it important that we know in detail those details, those stories about what goes on in the life of a farmer? In part B, I guess, to that question is, do we still run the risk of essentially creating this, this is an exotic story and it's sort of a novel concept and not really appreciating the story for what it is and still kind of using those details to, pull a lever and make money come out the other end?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. We'll come to that second part in a second. I guess the best example I can give is, the second episode of Filter Stories, where I flew to Ecuador and I spoke with Murray Cooper, who has an incredible story. Listen to the full episode to really understand how he ended up as a coffee farmer, a South African guy as a coffee farmer in the middle of Ecuador. But the story that was being told by roasters was that, Murray is... The facts were this. Murray paid his workers very well, even higher than the already very high Ecuadorian minimum wage. His farm was super ecological. And on top of all of it, his coffee was very good. It was used at the World Barista Championships. And you would think, especially coffee is driven by, we want to support farmers that are ecologically and socially positive and produce great quality coffee. It's almost like the unwritten rule of specialty coffee. That's why we're so passionate about what we do, because we see the positive power of all of this. And for some reason, which I talk about in the podcast, Murray's story wasn't being communicated appropriately. roasters were selling his coffee, making profit, but they weren't paying enough for his coffee. Did they really know the full extent of his story? Did they know that he was facing financial difficulty? Why didn't they know? And some of them even visited the farm. Like, how could they not know this? So consumers are, they're drinking a coffee, halfway across the world, and there's a little informational card, and the information card says, Mario Cooper is a famous photographer, and he grows great coffee, and it's this elevation and this varietal. Thanks for coming. But what if it said? What if that card said to reality? That, hey, Mario Cooper has invested a lot of money in this farm. He's actually transformed a lot of lives in his community. And it's not easy to run a business in Ecuador, and it's expensive. And that's why we've paid more for this, because we want to support rural Ecuadorians have a good chance at a future for their children. That's why we're paying more, and that's why we're asking you as a consumer to pay more. You can go next door and get a cheaper coffee from Colombia for half the price for the same quality, but we feel here that there is a family that's now just bought a motorbike because Murray gave them a higher income than they otherwise would have earned, and that's helping them get their kids to school. Why wasn't that story being told? I would pay more for that.
Sure. Yeah. No, understood. It makes sense. And then sometimes the second part of that question, of course, I guess now is, where do we draw the line between using information in an exploitative way, where we are seeking it out so that we can charge more, but maybe that money doesn't necessarily make its way back to the farmer. And it's not just about farmers, I guess, either. In this case, we're using farmers as an example, but finding out the details of a story that go beyond the bullet points that, we satisfy ourselves with. Like, where does it stop being practical and start being meaningful?
I think you get to that point where as a barista, as a cafe owner, as a roaster, you have connected personally with Murray. You've asked the questions that you need to ask to know him on a personal level, to know how much he's getting paid, whether he's getting paid enough. Within Murray's case, he wasn't. He was in a very difficult financial situation, but roasters weren't aware of this for the most part. Imagine a world where we sold coffee to consumers, where we actually knew the real story of the farmers. We just took that 20 minutes to make that Skype call halfway across the world. And then we can effectively communicate that story to our customers for why they're paying a little bit extra. Because we're supporting these different causes, ecological and social causes, because this farmer, we believe, is doing a really great job. That's what Murray was hoping people would do. Maybe he was naive. Maybe he was ahead of his time. I think there's something wrong if you go to all that effort and at the end of the day you still pay Murray a low price. I mean, yeah, okay, that's, I think, where you're exploiting him. But if you do it and you at the same time transfer more down to the farmer and make sure it's getting to the farmer by asking them, I should say, how much are you actually getting paid extra? I paid this. What did you receive? Where's the difference? Being transparent, then I think it's okay. I don't think we need to worry about using it just for marketing and actually not having an impact.
How does this apply to the coffee bar, where we're talking in terms of green buying and roasting, and people who have a more direct line to the producers, and then the baristas and managers and shift leaders, etc., who interact with the customer and represent the coffees to the customer. There are tons of stories floating around all over the place. Like, how do we tap into the power of stories in a retail setting, and not just for the relaying the information and the story of the farmer, but the story of our coworkers or the story of our customers?
Yeah, totally. And I think well, first of all, we need to acknowledge why understanding the stories of others helps for the business. If we look at it purely from a business perspective, if you understand your barista and the story they tell themselves as to why they're a barista working in your cafe, then you understand what motivates them. If you understand what motivates them, you do things which continue to motivate them, and that increases both their happiness at your place and how long they work for you. So that's one reason. look at your customers. If you understand your customers and the story that the customers have of why they come into your cafe, and why they choose a particular coffee, and what else is going on in their lives, and hear that story, then the customer feels like they're really being listened to, which they are. You're forging a genuine connection between the barista and the customer. And as a customer which has been on the receiving end of this treatment before, I am more motivated to frequent the cafe more often. I want to give. I want to feel part of this community. You're building a community by sharing and listening to stories, and putting stories at the top of how we interact with one another and listening to each other's stories. That creates a community. You create a great community. For me, the best cafes have really powerful communities that they've created by listening to one another and being empathetic and sharing stories. So I guess the question is, how do we do it day to day? Well, first of all, I guess you need a cafe owner, manager that prioritizes getting to know customers and getting to know their own employees by just sitting down and listening. It's very easy to listen. Listening is both a very challenging thing to do and also a very easy thing to do. It involves sitting down, asking a question. It could be a really inane question that just starts conversation, and then trying to put yourself in the perspective of another person. And then once you've done that, a question will naturally arise if you've done it properly, and then you ask that question. And you keep doing that for half an hour, and you'll be amazed. I mean, I'm always amazed at what you learn about the other person, which you can then factor into the decisions you make as a cafe owner or as a manager. As a barista, what makes a customer come into your store? Start with something as simple as a coffee. What do you think of the coffee? And they say, oh, it tastes good. It reminds me of this other thing I drank. Oh, well, why did it taste? Well, what was that other coffee you had? And then you keep asking questions. And before long, you'll get to the crux of why that customer chooses to come into the cafe every day. And you forge a genuine connection. This is a genuine community. Baristas need to feel empowered to ask those questions. Cafe owners should be having a people-first approach where they empower their baristas just to take 5 minutes out to get to know their customers every day. And the results of that, I can give you an example, is if you look at, so in the first episode of Filter Stories, I talk about Waking Life in Asheville, which is the cafe where the owners had a misogynistic podcast, and they spoke about the women that they, how to put this, they were pickup artists, and spoke about women that they had been with in a very misogynistic, hateful way. But while all that was happening, they had an employee, Sarah, who's working upstairs, whereas downstairs they were recording the podcast. And Sarah, she was completely oblivious to all of this, as was everybody else in Nashville. And she was front-facing, making a beautiful community where she loved her customers and her customers loved her. And they would basically be trading stories, understanding each other's stories and continuing to understand each other's stories. Then, when the podcast was made public and the cafe was shut down by the community, Sarah's out of a job. And the community that she had built for herself is also gone. But it's the community that saves her and enables her to be able to start her own cafe. And the reason she starts her own cafe is to bring the community that she loves so much back together. So to me, I think that story is like the reason we should be very story focused in terms of how we approach other people. Understand their stories and share your own, and that's how you build a community, which through thick and thin will come to help you and grow your business.
That's amazing. I love that perspective and that reality that really, I think, whether we realize it or not, keeps us in the industry, because we can build for ourselves this very practical veneer that, it's about the numbers, especially if you're a manager or owner. You're numbers focused, and sometimes it's hard to see the people behind those numbers. But the connection ultimately is what motivates us, and the community that we form is. The community is somewhat of an overused word. I feel like sometimes we use the word community and then move on, but we don't really explore it, because I think it's like looking into like deep water. You're scared but fascinated by it, and it's better to just assume you know everything about it than to really dive deep.
That's interesting. I mean, what does a great community look like? If your business is struggling, how many of your patrons will come to support you? If you have a cause that's really close to your heart, how many of your patrons will come and support you? If your patron is in trouble, will you go out that extra mile to support them? Answering those kind of questions gives you an insight into what kind of community you've created around your cafe.
Yeah, indeed. And it starts with the idea that everybody has a story that they want to share with people. We all want to be understood, and I think that inevitably leads to us sharing bits and pieces of our story with people and building trust with the customers where they can trust us with their story, because you look out into the cafe and there are people on laptops and people sharing coffee, and it's just little bits and pieces of stories unfolding in the cafe, the third place. It's just a catalyst for so much.
Oh, totally. There's so much potential there, incredible amount of potential to engage. And to engage and to build that community and that trusting space where, that person on the laptop will start to confide in you, why they're there and what they're trying to work through at the moment. And you can do the same. And ultimately that's that personal connection that even transcends the business. That will go into your friendships. That is a friendship that is created. If you take a step back and you think, well, what's our purpose in life here? I mean, we're born, we have a finite amount of time on this earth. Time is ticking. Where do we go? What do we do with our time? Well, I can't give you any answers there, but I can say that if you are surrounded by people who are encouraging and positive and warm, which is what a great community can do, then you're in a good place. Keep nurturing that. In fact, a business should have that as one of its core principles. People have invested their time, both the patrons and the employees and even the owner. We're all putting our time, having a shared experience through life in this one space. Let's make that as positive as an experience as possible for all people by understanding one another and being supportive.
Agreed. Well said. As we wrap up here, the story of this podcast with you, we are here, a lot of us, of course, to develop ourselves professionally, our careers, our businesses, to just grow, and how should we leave this conversation thinking about stories? Like, what philosophy should we be adopting to integrate stories well with what we do as we grow?
Well, keeping a focus on people is a great first step. We as an industry obsess over what kind of coffee is grown in the soil, how that coffee is processed, how it's shipped, how it's roasted, and how we brew it. And we put all this care and attention and time and story into the bean. But very often, that bean will be nowhere without the person who both planted it, produced that coffee, and of course the person who roasted it and the person who brewed it. And in many ways, those are even more important stories than just a simple crop, just a simple plant out of the ground. If we start focusing on the people, then we're able to, as an industry, be what I believe the specialty coffee industry can be, which is ecologically positive, socially progressive. When specialty coffee really works, this is what it can do. It gives people meaning in their lives as baristas, and it gives growers, producers in other parts of the world, a good income to continue producing this incredible crop. But to get to that point, we need to focus on the people. If we focus on the people, for example, at the growing level, then we understand, okay, are they getting paid enough? What can we do? What is their story, and can we help them? And can we help promote their story to our customers? Make that human connection, because at the moment, a lot of the stories we get told are on flashcards, and they're like, well, this coffee was grown at this elevation, and it's this varietal and this processing. It's dry facts. Dry facts. I mean, I don't know about you, but they don't do very much for me. But if we have a people first approach and understanding people's stories approach, we'd be asking the question, well, what is that farmer's story in their own words? And now we can convey that to our customers, and you can create that meaningful human connection, which is both positive for the barista because they feel more empowered and they're happier with their job because they like their customers more. The customers are happier because they have that human connection, that personal touch. The owner's happy because business is going up. Yeah, to not lose sight of people and their stories, and to always be asking and be querying what those stories are, ultimately is what I think can bring specialty coffee to it the best that it can be, which I believe is socially and ecologically very positive, with a delicious cup of joe that we can all enjoy.
Yes, agreed. This has really been a good exploration of the topic. A topic that I think is somewhat hard to nail down because it's used so much. We hear about stories. Stories are either something for children or they're something that people use to sell something. But I think what we've been discussing really transcends that. And I like what you're saying about how it really is about building that community and how there's something more than just serving coffee going on here, and it ultimately sustains us as people. We're not just cogs and we're not just robots. We need this connection, and I'm super thankful that your podcast, Filter Stories, is providing a platform for these stories. And so how can we stay in touch with you and what's going on with Filter Stories?
First things first, hop over to, I'm sure maybe there's a link. Go to filterstories.org. You can listen to the episodes there. Any podcast app, you'll find it there. Just subscribe to Filter Stories. I have an Instagram channel at Filter Stories Podcast as well, and a newsletter too, where I give recommendations for really fascinating articles, great story-driven podcasts as well. Yeah, and if you want to email me, it's hello@filterstories.org. I would love to hear from you. If you believe you have a story which you would want shared further, I'm here to listen to it.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, James, for taking time to share a little bit about your story, and your philosophy and approach is really going to benefit us immensely. And I'm really grateful for your time and your wisdom on this.
No, thank you, Chris, for inviting me on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Well, ultimately, we all take part in each other's stories at some level, and bringing an understanding to the table through curiosity and empathy can really help us make better decisions when we're serving customers, talking about farmers, helping our coworkers, or leading a team. So whether in a leadership position or you're just getting into coffee, those virtues that are behind good storytelling, curiosity and empathy, etc., getting underneath the surface level, those are keys to great relationships. And great relationships is what this coffee industry is based on, both professional and personal. And like I said in our self-care episode, which was a shift break episode last week, we're not coffee machines, we're humans. And the way we engage with one another should be with caring that recognizes each of us as a deep and complex person that has a story. We are built and are being built by each other as we go on in our careers. And I am thankful for James sharing his story with us, and also providing a platform where we can learn the story of others that will inevitably change the way we think about others in the industry for the better. So thank you, James. I really enjoyed our talk today. If you want to learn more about Filter Stories, you can go to filterstories.org, and I would encourage you to also subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any story that comes out. Now, if you want the show notes for this episode, you can go to the Keys to the Shop website, keystotheshop.com. On the sidebar, there is a place for you to put your email address, and when you do that, you'll be signed up to receive an email that has the show notes in it directly to your inbox. Very convenient. And those notes are basically the main takeaways and links that were discussed in each episode, the resources, if we're referencing websites or books and other organizations, things like that. We'll have those in the show notes for you also. So Go to keystotheshop.com, enter your email address, and it's just as easy as that. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. And I look forward to hearing from you if you have questions, feedback about the podcast. I'm always trying to make this show better and more relevant and helpful for you in your career. If you are also interested in working with me in your shop or one-on-one for training and consultation, you can just email me there as well, chris@keystotheshop.com. So I thank you for joining me today. I am a blessed man for having you as listeners. Keep doing amazing work in coffee. I hope you have an awesome week, and take inspiration from this episode and explore the stories that are around you this week. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.